Hey folks, and welcome back. So today I'm going to be talking about Unit 3. We're going to be learning about postmodernism. We're going to be going over the great literature that you read, and I'm going to just be um, giving you some information on your first essay project, the cultural identity essay. So basically all of those wonderful things that I just said. Okay, so let's start with postmodernism and what is postmodernism. So the time period that we're looking at is from about 1945 to about the mid 1990s, essentially until the advent of the internet, when that really took off in the mid to late 90s. So postmodernism takes the ideas that were present in modernism just a little bit further. So this is an era of prosperity for many, but definitely not all Americans. We definitely see the creation of sort of like a middle class in the United States. Um, Although, once again, this did not apply to all American citizens or all demographics. Um, and even though many Americans did well financially, we still see a lot of global conflict in this area or in this era. But it doesn't really touch home the same way that the previous world wars did. So we have the Korean and Vietnam Wars, we have the Cold War, and we have the Gulf War. And while these are definitely events that Americans paid attention to, it didn't affect the daily lives of most Americans like World War I and World War II did. So these wars and global conflicts are happening, but they're happening overseas, and it's sort of an out of sight thing for many Americans. We also see sort of like mass produced culture and consumerism rise a lot during this era, and then we have media saturation. We see the rise of technology. I mean, if you think about how technology changed just from 45 to 1990, technology just skyrocketed. And then we also saw the advent of 24-hour news coverage. And in a lot of ways, this kind of started with the O.J. Simpson trial. This idea that the news should always be going and you should always know what's going on in the world, even if it affected the daily lives of most Americans a little bit less than in previous eras. So here's a quote about postmodernism that I just love. It says, "Postmodernism was a reaction to modernism. Where modernism was about objectivity, postmodernism was about subjectivity. Where modernism sought a singular truth, postmodernism sought the multiplicity of truths." So, in a lot of ways, modernism was about finding out what is real and what is true, and postmodernism is more about finding out what is real for you and what is true for you, and acknowledging that just because something is a truth for you doesn't necessarily mean that it's a truth for somebody else. A lot of postmodern artists and authors, they created traditional works, but they sort of abandoned the traditional structure or rules for the narrative. So we get things like multiple narrators, unreliable narrators, changes in time like flashbacks or flash forwards. Sometimes there aren't no heroes in these pieces of literature. We have lots of anti-heroes. Happy endings are rare. A lot of times these writings are very critical and ironic. We get a lot of sarcastic characters and narrators. There's a big push to, question authority, question the past, question morality, and even the nature of truth. Like I said just a moment ago, acknowledging that just because something is true for one person doesn't necessarily make it true for another. And then we also see a big push to address social issues in writing from this time. So we begin to talk about issues with gender, race, sexuality, youth, politics, history, sort of all of those categories. And a lot of times, literary pieces from this time, the tone is very detached or sometimes even unemotional. And then the last thing that I have on this list of sort of like attributes of postmodernism is a focus on multiculturalism. Sort of this idea that instead of America being a melting pot where everybody becomes the same thing, that instead we should celebrate everybody's differences and celebrate the different cultures that exist within the United States. So, postmodernism, especially the literature, includes lots of experimental forms. We have confessional poets. We have genre fiction, which isn't completely new, but really takes off to where you have, you know, these genres are really exploding and going from, you know, a small number of pieces a year to just large amounts of literature. And they really, a lot of them develop like very specific followings. So this is going to include things like horror, science fiction, fantasy, mystery, all of these types of genres. And then once again, there's this push to have more diverse voices and more people telling their own stories. So let's look at some themes that pop up in postmodern literature. There's this question of like, what does it mean to be an American? Um, you know, prior to 1945, there's definitely this push of, you know, this is what the family should look like. This is what a woman should look like. This is what a man should look like. These are the attributes to masculinity. These are the attributes to femininity. There's no blurring of lines. Everybody needs to stay in their box, to stay in their corner. And these ideas are definitely challenged during the postmodern period. We have questions about American individualism and the self-made man. You know, there's this cry for people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And this is the first time in sort of like a nation we have people acknowledging that, you know, some of these people who were saying you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, they don't even have boots on. And so just kind of these questions of like, what is the American dream? And is it available to everybody? And what do you do when you have much more obstacles in your path to achieving that American dream than somebody else? Diversity and difference are going to be celebrated instead of shamed in a lot of different pieces of literature. And this includes things like sexuality, gender, socioeconomic status, region, where you come from, race, ethnicity, culture, etc. Sort of the idea of the American monolith is dead. There is no one thing that an American should look like. There's lots of themes dealing with like a loss of innocence and a coming of age. We, you know, see alienation versus community pop up, a changing moral landscape. This starts especially in the 60s and the 70s, and then just continues on through the decades. You know, there's questions of like, what is human nature? What is truth? What is objectivity? And of course, what is subjectivity? So the first author that we're going to look at today is Langston Hughes. So Langston Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri in 1902. His mother was a school teacher who wrote poetry. His father was a storekeeper, but he wanted to be a lawyer. He was denied the opportunity to take the bar exam, probably because of his race. And so Langston Hughes' father kind of pushed a lot of the goals that maybe he had had for his life onto Hughes. So Langston Hughes is one of those authors that's kind of in the middle there between the modern and the postmodern period. So some of the stuff that he does is more modern, and some of the stuff that he does is more postmodern. So Hughes started at Columbia University, and then against his father's wishes, he ended up dropping out. He participated in jazz and blues bands near Harlem. He decided that he wanted to see the world, and so he got a job as a steward on a freight ship bound for West Africa. After that, he traveled to Paris. He had a variety of different jobs and just kind of traveled around Africa and Europe, just kind of to get a sense of the world and to see what was out there. Even at a young age, he was a pretty prolific writer. The Negro Speaks of Rivers was one of his first published poems, and he wrote that when he was 18 years old. So Hughes is considered a leading voice in the Harlem Renaissance. I put that crash course video up in our Blackboard shelf for you to watch. Please watch it. It's got some great information on it. But it's important to recognize Langston Hughes' addition and contribution to these great literary movements. So in his works, he talks a lot about people who are impacted by racism, people who are impacted by sexism. He talks about Southern violence. Remember that most of the things that he's writing come before the civil rights era. Not that violence magically went away after the civil rights movement, but there was just so much violence against African Americans, especially in the South during Hughes's lifetime. He talks a lot about Harlem street life. He talks about poverty and what it means to not have enough and really to not be able to fulfill your dreams and what it feels like to have dreams that you can't fulfill because of the conditions of your life. He talks about prejudice and hunger and hopelessness. So we see a lot of these themes from both the modern and the postmodern period pop up in his work. So Hughes used the social, political, and religious aspect of the African American experience as stepping stones for poetic expression. He really kind of announced to the world that the streets of Black America contained a culture that was rich and vibrant and fiercely poetic. And, he kind of came out and said, I don't want you to celebrate me despite the fact that I am Black. I want you to celebrate me because of the fact that I am Black. And that is something good and worthy of celebration. Okay, so this is his poem, Theme from English B. I love this poem. It's really interesting to see kind of where his mind was as a young man. So it says this. It says, the instructor said, go home and write a page tonight and let that page come out of you. Then it will be true. I wonder if it's that simple. I am 22, colored, born in Winston-Salem. I went to school there, then Durham, then here to this college on the hill above Harlem. I'm the only colored student in my class. The steps from the hill lead down into Harlem, through a park, then I cross St. Nicholas, 8th Avenue, 7th, and come to the Y, the Harlem Branch Y, where I take the elevator up to my room, sit down, and write this page. It is not easy to know what is true for you or me at 22, my age. But I guess I'm what I feel and see and hear. Harlem, I hear you. Hear you, hear me, we two. You, me, talk on this page. I hear New York too. Me? Who? Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present, or records, Bessie, Bop, or Bach. I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things that other folks like who are other races. So will my page be colored that I write? Being me, it will not be white, but it will be a part of you, instructor. You are white, yet a part of me as I am a part of you. That's American. Sometimes perhaps you don't want to be a part of me, nor do I often want to be a part of you. But we are, that's true. As I learn from you, I guess you learn from me. And although you're older and white and somewhat more free, this is my page for English B. So we can see, first of all, this is just a brilliant poem. What he does with the imagery here and the juxtaposition between him and his instructor, how they are the same but also different. We can see how he is both like his other classmates because they're taking the same courses, but also is different because he has to live at the Y. He doesn't have the opportunity to live on campus. And how he comes up with this idea that everybody we encounter are a part of who we are, and we're a part of who they are, even if we don't want to be. And we are learning from everybody just like they are learning from us. And it's really kind of up to you what you are teaching those around you. Okay, now let's talk about Bernard Malamud. He was born in New York City in 1914. He died in 1986. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning Jewish American author. So he wrote novels, but he was really prized for his short stories. And one of the things that makes him so great is he creates these vivid images of immigrant characters, specifically Jewish immigrant characters, and their lives. He talks a lot about how the New York City Jewish community works and functions, and he, just uses them as sort of the way that he tells these wonderful stories. Okay, so I hope that you loved The Magic Barrel as much as I do. It's just this really interesting, fascinating story for a couple of reasons. It was published in 1958, but it really centers on the Jewish experience of in America, but also a lot of the themes that are in this piece are kind of universal themes. So I just listed some of the things. This list is not in any way complete. These are just themes that popped out to me when I read it. So the first theme that I have on this list is religion, and in this story, the author really questions, like, what does religion mean, and what does religion mean to you? So we have this narrator who's studying to be a rabbi, but he realizes halfway through the story that he doesn't really love God. It's more of a cultural thing. And so here we can see that theme sort of plays out. We have, there's definitely a theme of like old ways versus new ways. The rabbi has questions of how he's going to get his new wife, and he struggles. He doesn't want to go out and just meet somebody. He wants to, or he decides to hire a matchmaker and see, if he can just basically be handed a wife, so that he doesn't have to like be rejected, and he doesn't have to meet somebody that ends up not working out, and he just want to kind of skip all of that stuff. And there's definitely talk of like arranged marriages versus like spontaneous or love marriages, and which one's better for the Jewish community. There's a lot of talk about superficiality. He has Finkel has all of these rules about what is okay and not okay. He doesn't want a widow because that's like damaged goods. He doesn't want somebody too old or too young or that has this job. He doesn't want somebody that has any health issues. He doesn't, so he has all these rules about what he wants, and kind of what he's looking for is non-existent, right? The perfect person isn't out there. And so we can kind of see his superficiality in how he approaches finding a wife. And then, of course, we have the theme of dishonesty. Everybody is kind of dishonest with everybody in this story, but the matchmaker especially, is talking everybody up and just, oh, no, they're 29. Well, really, they're 36. Or, just trying to make them appear better than they are. And then lastly, we get this, theme of love and what is real love. Finkel falls in love with a picture, essentially. But in the end of the story, we see that Finkel and the matchmaker's daughter probably are, going to be a good match, and they kind of save each other. But there's all these questions of like, does love come before marriage or after marriage? And one of the reasons that I just love this story is because you get this great um, just view into this Jewish culture. Okay, and the last author that we are talking about today is Adrienne Rich. She was born in 1929 in Baltimore. She started writing poetry at a really young age and began publishing when she was in college. So she went to Radcliffe College, and it was 1951 that she published her first collection. 2 years after that, she married Alfred Conrad. They had three sons pretty quickly, but they always had a really difficult marriage. They separated in 1970, and sadly, he committed suicide about a year later. But she continued to write poetry. She focused a lot of her work on social activism, feminism, women's issues, those sorts of things. In 1976, she came out as a lesbian, and from that point on was just a representative of the LGBT community and wrote about her experiences and what her life was like, and she advocated for LGBTQ rights her whole life. So Rich died in 2012 at the age of 82 from complications from arthritis. Okay, so this is her poem, Living in Sin. This one wasn't in the selections from your textbook that I had you read, but it's just one of my favorite poems from her, so I wanted to share it with you. It said, "She had thought the studio would keep itself, no dust upon the furniture of love, half heresy to wish the taps less vocal. The panes relieved of grime, a plate of pears, a piano with a Persian shawl, a cat stalking the picturesque, amusing mouse, had risen at its urging. Now that at 5 each separate stair would writhe under the milkman's tramp, that morning light so coldly would delineate the scraps of last night's cheese and 3 skeptical bottles, that on the kitchen shelf among the saucers a pair of beetle eyes would fix her own, envoy from some village in the moldings. Meanwhile he, with a yawn, sounded a dozen notes on the keyboard, declared it out of tune, shrugged at the mirror, rubbed at his beard, went out for cigarettes. While she, jeered by the minor demons, pulled back the sheets and made the bed and found a towel to dust the tabletop, and let the coffee pot boil over on the stove. By evening she was back in love again, though not so wholly, but throughout the night. She woke sometime to feel the daylight coming like a relentless milkman up the stairs." And so this is kind of a poem about the difference between our expectations and fantasies and real life. So the poem is called Living in Sin, which is probably a reference to living with somebody before you're married to them. But she has sort of this idyllic idea of what living with this man is going to be like. She says she thought the studio would keep itself, meaning she never like imagined the day-to-day tasks that it took to live with somebody, right? Like somebody has to clean the apartment, somebody has to dust the furniture, somebody has to make the beds, all of these things. And she just imagined all of the good parts of living with somebody. And she's really become disillusioned by what is happening. She sees this guy and he's kind of on her nerves, right? He's just, playing piano, he's yawning, he's shrugging, he's, going out for cigarettes, and she's just kind of like annoyed with everything that he's doing. But then it says, by evening she was back in love again. And I feel like that's so indicative of how emotions work. I mean, you can be annoyed with somebody one moment and then in love with them the next moment. So we kind of see that maybe this relationship isn't all of the things that she pictured it was going to be, or that she dreamed that it was going to be. And so she's kind of coming to terms of like, what does an actual relationship when you are living with somebody look like? So I hope you enjoyed those 3 authors that we read this week. And just, got an opportunity to read through those selections in your textbook so that you can understand more about them. If you have any questions about the authors that we're reading, just please reach out and let me know. But now I want to take a moment of your time and talk to you about the cultural identity essay. So this is our first essay project for the semester. And for this assignment, you are going to write a reflective essay explaining your cultural identity. You can use How It Feels to Be Color Me by Zora Neale Hurston as an example of what an essay like this might look like. That's not a blueprint. You don't have to follow the example, but that's just one that you could use. So here's some questions I want you to think about as you're writing this essay. So let's start with what elements of your culture have most influenced your identity. And remember that your culture can be any part of your identity. There's not one specific part of your identity that we're talking about when we talk about culture, when these authors write about their culture. Think about how your identity compares to that of maybe your peers, your parents, or other people in your life. You might consider, like, perhaps how did a cultural conflict, either internal or external, influence your perspective? And you might think about how a particular cultural element, food or language or clothing, could be used as a metaphor or a central idea to really focus your essay. Now, none of these questions that you're going to work through, you don't have to include all of these. This is just kind of to get you thinking about some things that you might want to talk about in your essay. So you don't have to follow like a typical, 5-paragraph essay format or anything like that, but you do still want to have an organized structure. Your essay must have an introduction, section or paragraph, some body paragraphs or body sections, and a conclusion section. I'm going to also ask that you make sure that you also include a thesis or thematic statement somewhere in your essay. So here's the requirements excuse me, for this essay. So we're going to write this essay in MLA format. If you have questions about that, let me know and I'll hook you up with some resources. This essay needs to be 3+ pages. Remember, that's typed, double-spaced. And those 3 pages, 3 full pages is the minimum. If you want to go beyond that, that's fine. Visual aids are fine for this assignment, but you cannot take up more than half of 1 page with visual aids. If you are not the owner or creator of the visual aid, then give the original creator credit. But if you want to use a picture that you own, a picture that you took, a picture of your family, anything like that, that's totally fine. There are no outside sources required for this assignment. You do not have to use any, but if you do use any outside sources, then they must be cited correctly with in-text citations and an MLA style works cited page. But this is your cultural identity and how you see yourself. So do not feel like you have to use outside sources. Other than that, for Unit 3, please check out those other resources that I have available to you. There's a video clip that has other authors talking about Adrienne Rich shortly after her death and just kind of how she lived her life and about her literary career. It's great. And then that Langston Hughes crash course video that I provided. And then we have a reading journal like we do every unit. And then we have a discussion board. But that is it for Unit 3. If at any point you have questions, comments, concerns, come see me during my office hours, send me an email, any of that, I am always here and happy to help.